Week 30, Overview. Give me liberty. This week, we're going to study a period of American history that we might call the calm before the storm. Over the space of 12 years, 1763 to 1775, about 3 million British subjects went from taking pride in being part of the most powerful empire on earth to waging a war for independence from that empire. This week's study is about this change of heart. Great Britain had been fighting wars with European adversaries on and off for the last 75 years. After the decisive French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War concluded, King George III and his British Parliament had peace in Europe and huge war debts to pay. They felt that their prosperous colonies had been well defended by British soldiers and capital. They decided to govern these hard-won colonies much more strictly and extract more revenues from them in the future. That made sense to the British. But the American colonists had their own perspective. For their part, the colonists had just finished fighting shoulder to shoulder with the British against the French and the Indians. They had seen firsthand the weaknesses of the redcoats, endured their snubs, and then experienced the heady feeling of success from the courage of their own troops. There was thus a growing feeling in the colonies that they didn't really need the help of their mother country anymore. As usual in Tapestry of Grace, we aren't just watching events in America unfold. Things are still happening in Europe and around the world. During the 12 years we're studying this week, scientific discoveries and journeys of exploration were made. As part of a scientific voyage to help determine the Earth's distance from the Sun, Captain James Cook explored the South Pacific and discovered Australia, which he claimed for Great Britain. In France, chemistry was turned upside down when Antoine Lavoisier discovered oxygen. In Britain, James Watt invented the steam engine. Those last two scientific discoveries were paving the way for an industrial revolution that would dominate the next century. But most Europeans found war a far more pressing concern than science or invention. Britain was on the winning side in the 7 Years' War. It was harder for the losers. Austria, France, and Spain were struggling with money problems. The Prussians were England's victorious allies, but victory was expensive. Prussia was struggling too. Not everybody was struggling, though. One country seized the opportunity to expand. Catherine the Great of Russia teamed up with Prussia and Austria to partition a helpless neighbor. The three great powers gobbled up big chunks of Poland in 1772. In 1793 they took more, and finished Poland off completely in 1795. Napoleon revived Poland in 1807. Catherine wanted to expand Russia's naval power, too. The Russian fleet was based in St. Petersburg, bottled up in the Baltic Sea. Catherine wanted warm water ports. She fought the Sultan of the Turkish Ottoman Empire for the vast areas south and east of Moscow. Under Catherine, Russia took what is now the Ukraine from the Muslims. She built new Russian-speaking cities on the Black Sea. Britain's new king didn't have Catherine's ambition. George III took the throne in 1760, near the end of the 7 Years' War. His reign began and ended badly. It started off on the wrong foot. During George's coronation ceremony in 1761, one of the largest jewels in his new crown fell out. Then he spent the last 10 years of his life in seclusion in Windsor Castle, hopelessly insane. In the years in between, George's reign was marked with troubles. Though he was capably served by William Pitt the Elder, one of England's most remarkable statesmen, George wanted peace at any price. After making peace with France, George tried to pacify the Indians of North America. Pontiac, chief of the Ottawa tribe, launched a major uprising in 1763 to drive all soldiers and settlers out of the Great Lakes region. Pontiac's warriors destroyed 8 forts and killed or captured hundreds of colonists. The British Army responded with force, but also with diplomacy. King George issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which placed a boundary on the westward expansion of the American colonies. By keeping settlers east of the line, he hoped to avoid having to send more soldiers west. Even so, George's advisers urged him to maintain a standing army of 10,000 troops in America. Lord Grenville, the Secretary of the Treasury, estimated this would cost Britain £200,000. That was a problem. Britain's national debt had risen by 1,000,000% over the last 10 years. From £75,000 before the 7 Years' War to £800 million in 1764. Even with the proclamation, the advisers urged him to maintain a standing army of 10,000 soldiers. He grudgingly agreed, but he wanted the colonists to pay for it, at least part of it. To that end, Britain began to enact a series of revenue-raising acts. The Sugar Act of 1764 put a 3-penny tariff on every gallon of molasses brought to New England from a foreign port. Britain had islands in the Caribbean that produced molasses, like Jamaica, but their prices were nowhere near those of French or Spanish territories. New England merchants were hit hard by this tax because they depended on cheap Caribbean molasses to make potent New England rum. The ships carrying molasses and rum sailed two sides of a triangle. The ships on the third leg of the triangle carried slaves. Molasses flowed from the Caribbean to New England, and rum flowed from New England to Africa, and slaves kidnapped in Africa were shipped back to the Caribbean. By the way, New England wasn't the only rum-producing point of the triangle. Old England was even more involved in the trade. Children at every learning level will study one particular English slave trader this week, John Newton, the man who wrote Amazing Grace. The Sugar Act hit merchants hard. Britain cut it from 3 pennies to 1 in a couple of years, but kept looking for other ways to raise revenues and cut expenses. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act forced colonists to provide British soldiers with living quarters, firewood, candles, and beer. The Stamp Act required them to pay for a tax stamp on newspapers, playing cards, and legal documents. Americans were irritated by the Sugar Act, especially New Englanders, who used imported molasses to make rum. They dragged their feet in complying with the Quartering Act, giving British soldiers less than their due. But they were outraged by the Stamp Act, which seemed to violate a settled principle of British law: no taxation without representation. Most Americans know the phrase, no taxation without representation, but not all know how well it expressed the traditional relationship between the English people and the Crown. Under the unwritten British Constitution, English kings had no right to impose taxes on the people. Taxes were supposed to be a gift from the people to their king, and could only be levied by the people's representatives in Parliament assembled. That worked fine as long as everybody who got taxed had some kind of representative in Parliament. The colonies didn't have such representatives, though. They considered themselves loyal subjects of King George III, but not of Parliament. The colonists had their own colonial legislatures. These could have lawfully imposed taxes on the colonies, if they had wanted to. The colonial legislatures might have voluntarily raised taxes if King George had asked them to, but he didn't. It was a matter of control, pure and simple. Neither king nor Parliament were willing to concede the point of principle the colonists insisted on. So the colonists refused to obey the Stamp Act. Britain tried to enforce it from an ocean away, using tactics that violated even more fundamental principles of English liberty. 9 colonies sent delegates to a gathering in New York City in 1765 called the Stamp Act Congress, which drew up a series of resolutions. Students in the government elective will discuss those resolutions this week. The Congress spelled out American objections to the Stamp Act and the methods used to enforce it. These clumsy and controversial efforts to squeeze money out of America outraged William Pitt, the architect of Britain's victories in the 7 Years' War. He was no longer part of George III's administration. In 1766, Pitt made an impassioned speech against the Stamp Act on behalf of these American colonists. He said, "Gentlemen, sir, I have been charged with giving birth to sedition in America. They have spoken their sentiments with freedoms against this unhappy act, and that freedom has become their crime. Sorry I am to hear the liberty of speech in this House imputed as a crime." Pitt argued that the Stamp Act was both unconstitutional and impractical. Parliament repealed the unpopular act a few months later, but replaced it immediately with a new act proposed by Charles Townshend. The Townshend Act placed tariffs on items that had never been subject to taxes before: lead, paint, paper, china, and tea. Again, Americans saw it as an unconstitutional tax and responded with boycotts. British merchants were caught in the middle of this struggle between Crown and colonies. They risked their capital to send valuable cargoes across the Atlantic, only to have them shipped back for lack of customers. The merchants complained to King and Parliament, and by 1770 most of the Townshend Acts had been repealed. Most, but not all. Britain left one tariff in place, a tax on tea. Once again, Parliament insisted on this to prove their principle. They chose tea because it was more popular in the colonies than England. In one of history's little quirks, England preferred coffee at that time, and Americans preferred tea. British leaders kept the duty on tea, but then lowered the price of tea itself. The East India Company cut prices so low they even undercut smuggled tea. They were willing to lose money to get the colonists to concede the constitutional point. If the colonists paid the taxes on this tea, England would have won the essential argument. The colonists saw through the tea trick, though. They remained firm, even though it meant spending more money or drinking coffee instead of tea. No major American port would allow the East India Company tea into its harbor. Britain grew increasingly impatient with her increasingly stubborn colonies. Boston was particularly obstinate. British soldiers fired on an unruly Boston mob in 1770, killing 5 citizens immediately in what was called the Boston Massacre. The soldiers who fired the shots were put on trial, where Massachusetts Attorney John Adams defended them. Adams was a leader of the Patriot cause, but he was also a firm believer in the rule of law and the right to a fair trial. With Adams's help, 6 of the soldiers were acquitted, and the rest got off with a manslaughter charge instead of being convicted of murder. Boston never really settled down after that. Things came to a head in December of 1773 when the British officials threatened to force port authorities to unload 3 ships' worth of tea. Massachusetts citizens petitioned the royal governor to intervene, but he hid out at his country estate. The citizens took matters into their own hands. A group that called themselves the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Indians and snuck onto the ships. There they destroyed the entire shipment of tea, ripping open the chests and dumping them into the harbor. King George was furious when he heard of the Boston Tea Party and ordered Boston Harbor closed until they paid for all the ruined tea. He ordered the immediate alteration of the government of Massachusetts and its courts. He sent 4 new regiments of soldiers to Massachusetts, commanding them to be quartered in colonists' homes. These punitive acts were intended to crush Boston's resistance and were collectively referred to as the Intolerable Acts of 1774. King George, quoting Julius Caesar, said, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." Bostonians faced a stark choice: financial ruin or capitulation to the king. Massachusetts had no real reason to hope the other colonies would come to her aid, but representatives of 12 of the colonies met in Philadelphia to give a united response to the Intolerable Acts. This First Continental Congress sent entreaties to King George III to stop the Intolerable Acts. They formed articles of association to establish a coordinated protest in order to aid Boston, particularly through a new boycott on English goods. They also called for a more extended meeting, called the Second Continental Congress, which met in 1775. That was the Congress that adopted the Declaration of Independence and governed America during the Revolutionary War. So, last week, we saw the colonies were divided independent. They had ignored the plan of union that Benjamin Franklin offered at the start of the French and Indian War at the Albany Congress. But colonial victories in that war and the oppressive British policies that followed it changed the equation. In just 12 years, new emotions and events were producing enough unity and resolve to propel the colonies into a revolutionary war.